Hey everybody, welcome to chapter 25. In this chapter, we're going to talk about economic growth. This is pretty much when GDP is rising. So, we talked about GDP and why it was important in um, chapter 24, but in this chapter, we're going to look at why do we want GDP to grow and why does it matter? Um, Looking at the United States, real GDP adjusted for inflation was 1.7 trillion in 1950 and it was 21.4 trillion just last year in 2019. Um, GDP per capita went up from $11,672 per person to $58,388 per person. So, one of the things that we look at GDP for and where we want to see it go is we want our standard of living to increase over time. Um, we talked about growth a little bit in chapter 24, but we're really going to talk about it here. And how do we make it happen in this chapter? So, to go forward, we always go back. And when we talk about economic growth, we kind of take it for granted a little bit living in a rich country and a country that very typically doesn't have many recessions. And when we do, we go right back to growth. Um, but historically, growth is relatively new. It didn't really start until the Industrial Revolution. When we think back to our production possibilities curve, if you remember, the things that caused growth were an increase in quality of resources, an increase in quantity of resources, or technology. So here we're really looking at, with the Industrial Revolution, an increase in technology that ever since then has continued to boom. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, it was pretty common for people to subsist on the exact same uh, standard of living as their parents and their parents before them and their parents before them. And there was not much difference between people. For instance, in Greece, a peasant living in 300 BC had the same material standard of living as a peasant living in 1500 AD. Same in China and all over the place. That doesn't mean that the economies didn't expand. They did. There was more output, but at the same time, population was rising. And so they never had an increase of output more than their population. So standard of living really didn't change. Then comes the Industrial Revolution. And for economic historians, we date it at 1776 with the invention of the steam engine. This kind of fundamentally changed the world. And ever since the Industrial Revolution, we have developed new technologies over and over and over that have continued to keep our economies growing. With the steam engine, we were able to have factories and produce on the mass scale instead of doing everything by hand. It also led to steam ships and steam locomotives to create a more global economy where we were able to transport goods much faster than ever before, which we're going to talk about eventually increasing demand. The key point of all of this is the last 200 and so years have been fundamentally different than anything before. For the first time, once the Industrial Revolution hits, output begins to grow faster than population, and our standard of living starts to increase, and we start to see what we call modern economic growth. It started slowly at about 0.75% per year, which we think that's nothing. But when you've had nothing for thousands of years, 0.75% is huge. So, what we call this is modern economic growth, output per person rising. And that's what we want to see. And what we've found out is this has happened at different paces throughout the world, but it really has to do with when did industrialization start in your country? The best part about modern economic growth is it has led to our ability to um, increase material standard of living, increase cultural activities, because once we start mass producing, people have more leisure time. We start to see um, a push for public education because now we don't need kids working in the factories because we're able to produce the same amount, if not even more, without them. Um, and so it also had a cultural impact. Like I said before, it's been an uneven distribution. Depending on when a country started or region started industrialization, has kind of impacted where they are in the process today. Industrialization started in Britain and then moved to France and Germany and Western Europe. And then it moved to the US, Canada, Australia. That was the mid 1800s. By 1870s, you see Japan, but then there's kind of a pause to the mid 1900s when Asia kind of comes on board with Central and South America. And then really Africa, their modern industrialization is just kind of get going in the past, 30, 40 years. I love this graphic because it kind of shows these differences. In 1820, the US and Western Europe were a little bit ahead of everybody in terms of their GDP per capita. But they start taking off sooner than everybody else because they hadn't started industrialization sooner. Then the next one that you see kind of take off here is Japan, who was next on board. Then you see Latin America starting, Africa is barely getting going here, and Asia, excluding Japan's down here. Eventually, what economists think will happen is we will continue to rise and we can get to a point where GDP per capita is high across the world. This is a great video that I recommend that you watch. He kind of does this data in real time, and you can kind of see how it's reflected in the health and wealth across the world. So our next goal is we want to define economic growth as an importance. Why do we care? And the rule of 70. So economic growth is defined two ways: an increase in real GDP or an increase in real GDP per capita. So real GDP is just, look at GDP in 2006 was 12.9 trillion. It was 13.2 trillion in 2007. So our economy grew at 2.1%. Remember that formula, new minus old divided by old times 100. Our rate of change between those 2 years was 2.1%. This is typically what we see reported when we hear about economic growth. The other definition of growth is real GDP per capita increasing over time. Economists like this one because it gives us a little clearer picture of what's actually happening. So here in 2006, real GDP per capita was $43,000, 432. 2007, 43,929. Here, our growth rate is 1.1%. So you can see in this time, even though our output was rising, so was our population. Why do we care about real GDP per capita? It gives us more about living standards. When you compare China and Denmark, just looking back, let's go 2008. China's GDP was 4.3 trillion and Denmark's was 343 billion. Those are vastly different numbers. China's about $4 trillion ahead, but when you bring in population and GDP per capita, Denmark's at 62,118 and China's around 3,267. So even though China's GDP is much higher, the standard of living in Denmark is way higher than China because population matters. Why do we want to have growth, and why is it such a strong economic goal across the world? Well, at the end of the day, we want a higher standard of living than we've had before. And when we have economic growth, society's better able to solve socioeconomic problems. The long and short of it is it lessens the burden of scarcity. When we have more stuff, higher output means higher income, we are able to do more without giving up as much. Opportunity cost is still going to exist, but we're able to do more. Growth can be significant. I know I talked about 0.75% just a minute ago, but we think that's nothing. But when you talk about the GDP of the economy, if we talk about the US right now at 21.4 trillion, the difference between 3% and 4% rate of growth is about $214 billion. That's a lot. So this rate of growth matters. We like to use the rule of 70, which is a mathematical approximation that can tell us how long it will take for something to double. We're going to use it to see how long will it take a nation's GDP to double. And what we're going to do is we're going to take 70 divided by the annual percentage rate of growth. So in this case, if China's GDP is 8%, is growing at 8% per year, 70 divided by 8 means in roughly 9 years, their GDP will double. If Italy is growing their economy at 2% per year, GDP is growing at 2% per year, their economy is going to double in about 35 years. This shows growth in the United States from 1950 to 2009. You can see our GDP has been increasing, our real GDP. So has our population, but also our GDP per capita has been increasing because our GDP is rising faster than our population. A couple things, once again, that aren't covered in these figures, and I'm going to go through quickly just because we've talked about them before, is the improved products and services. So this is going to understate our well-being. Added leisure, once again, it doesn't account in GDP. So our work week going down is not included in this. So that's going to understate our well-being. And other impacts of if we're debasing the physical environment and creating stressful work, then this is actually going to overstate our well-being. If the opposite's happening and we get stronger environmental protections and greater security in work, this is going to understate our well-being. Growth is not constant. It is not smooth. It is changing. We've been in a time of unprecedented growth, but given the coronavirus and what's happening right now with businesses shutting down, it is very possible that we are going to see our growth slow down for quite a long period of time. As always, we're economists, so we like to measure things, and the World Economic Forum compiles what we call the Growth Competitiveness Index. And the United States does tend to be towards the top of this. It basically ranks a country's ability to grow. So that's it for chapter 24. If you have any questions, just post them in the discussion board.